Got a buzz up here. Maybe the piano. Well, good morning. Glad to see you this morning. Today is our last sermon in our community series, and it went longer than we thought we were going to do, but all in the Lord's timing. And so I want to start this morning with an intro that's maybe a little bit unorthodox. Is that okay? Is it okay for me to do something unorthodox at New Life? I don't know if y'all are okay with that. We're very by the book around here. By the book. I'm going to try to resurrect some of my teenage ability. I didn't have a lot of abilities when I was a teenager, but I was pretty good at one thing. So let me give me a second. So if I do poorly, it's because it's not my guitar. If it's my guitar, I'd be great. It'd be amazing. No doubt. I'm sure y'all believe that. And the pick, he likes thin picks, and I like thick picks. That's probably also. I'm more nervous about this than the sermon. Let's see how it goes. There we go. Best guitar solo sermon intro you've ever heard in your life, I'm sure. So if you don't know, if you're not a small snippet of a much more complicated sermon solo from a Journey song, and I thought about playing it before, and then I would play my bit, and then I'd show you that I could play it. But then I thought, if I don't show them the real thing, they won't know how bad mine is, and that way we're good to go. I bring that up because I learned that solo. Oh, I did the math this morning. Now I've forgotten. Approximately around 2003. So you can just do the math there. How long that ago that was? Quite a while ago. I'd only been going to this church for about a year. And Larry and another guy that used to go to church here, who's a big guitar player, and a friend of Larry's that I didn't know, invited me to go along with them to a concert. Now, it's not a concert that normal people go to, and I really hate Larry's not in here to hear this, because he's the only one that's going to get any of these jokes. But it's a concert of like super highly accomplished rock guitar players, okay? And they just played like rock music, and like the guitar players were so good they didn't even have a singer. They just played guitar, and that was the whole bit, right? It's called the G3 Tour, and they did it, and blah, 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 and I won't bore you with any more details. But I got invited to go because I was like a guitar player, and I was into that sort of thing, and I started coming to church here. And I don't know that Larry liked me at all, or the other guy. The other guy was the guy that invited me to New Life, who doesn't come here anymore. But I got to go to this concert with him, and what happened on the trip was that we went a little bit early. It was over in Winston. And because we were with Larry, if you know Larry at all, we had to stop at a pawn shop because when you're with Larry Cheek, you stop at a pawn shop. That's just what you do. And I bought a CD, not a Christian CD, but a Journey CD, and not like a Christian Journey CD, but the band Journey. And that CD was on it, or that song was on it. And so we got in the car, and Larry was kind of my guitar teacher at the time. And he said, "You've got to learn this solo." And he puts the CD in the car, and we listened to the solo a few times. And later at guitar practice, he chose me how to do it. But then it was like a month later that I got the CD back because we left it in the CD and player in the car, you know. And so I only had the other CD. It was a 2 CD set, so at least I got to listen to a little Journey in the meantime. But anyway, so I learned that solo, or at least that part of it. I didn't try to work up the other part. If I ever knew it, I don't know if I did. But anyway, the bus. Oh. So, but I learned that song because we went on that trip to that concert with some other guys from church. And is it significant that I learned a guitar solo? Clearly not. But what's significant is that story, more than a story about going to hear really good guitar players or being geeked out about going to a pawn shop and buying a Journey CD or anything like that, that story is significant because it's a story of Christian community. And as we're going to talk in a little bit, it's valuable because it's a varied community. It wasn't just me and a bunch of bros. It was a variety of ages and different people at different stages of faith and so on and so forth. So I want to start this morning in Colossians chapter 3, and we're going to use that story of going to a concert with some guys from church as a springboard to what we're going to talk about this morning. Larry, did you realize that G3 was in 2003? It was that long ago? I had to look up when it was, like who was on the roster and remember where we went, and it was 2003, yeah. I was like 13 or 14. I'd only been going here about a year. So if you will put Colossians chapter 3 up there, and let's read this first verse to get into this idea of Christian community. It's our last sermon in this series on community. It says, "Let the message about the Messiah dwell richly among you, teaching and admonishing one another in all hymns and singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God." And what this verse teaches us is that all Christians ought to be musicians. And all the worship leaders said, amen. I'm kidding. But what it does remind us of is the necessity of teaching other believers those things that you know. And sometimes we over-spiritualize verses like that. Well, I got to teach them the Greek or the Hebrew, or I don't really know the Bible perfectly well, or I get Joseph and Jacob mixed up sometimes, and I'm not a teacher, and so that verse does not apply to me. But it doesn't say that. It says, "Let the message of the Messiah dwell richly among you, teaching and admonishing one another," or teaching and correcting one another, "in all wisdom, and singing hymns and psalms and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God." Now, I chose this song because this verse because it had a musical sort of idea behind it with the psalms and hymns and all that. But there's many other verses with this same idea that we teach one another those things that we know, specifically the things of the Lord. But like I said, sometimes we over-spiritualize that thing. When Larry taught me that guitar solo, did it change my Christian faith? No. Did it make me a professional guitar player like I thought I wanted to be? No. But it was a significant moment of teaching in my life. Now, it's funny how the Lord works. I'm beginning to realize, I've asked myself sometimes, like, why did I spend all this time in my bedroom practicing guitar, like just to impress the guys at school? Like, this was not helpful use of time at all. But now Leggie's coming up, and all of our children have shown some inclination to music. But Leggie, I think, is legit going to be a musician. Our littlest redhead, which is good. And he seems to be good with both hands, so he may be a drummer. But that's just so he'll almost be a musician. I'm just kidding. That's a little drummer joke for you. I was in drumline school, so I can say that. Anyway, so. We must teach and admonish or correct one another, and it's teach what you know. It's not necessarily teach. You don't have to be a Greek scholar or know depth of theology, but you teach what you know. And hopefully, if you're a follower of Jesus, you know something about following Jesus. So you can teach other people about following Jesus. And I don't remember the times when Larry and I would have guitar lessons, or I don't remember a lot of details of when I was coming up and we had 3 guitar players and I was the third string guitar player, so like I didn't even get to stand on the stage, and because we have such a large stage. And I don't remember a lot of those details, but I do know that in the midst of music, something I cared about, and guitar playing and all this sort of thing, that there was conversations about the things of the Lord. There was singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs of the Lord, and a growing and a maturity around people of faith in the midst of this thing that I maybe was more interested in than Jesus at the time, if I'm honest. Like I said, I was a young believer at the time. And the Lord certainly can use, whether it's crocheting or guitar playing or kayaking, He can certainly use those things as a means by which to bring joy to your own life and to other people's lives, as long as we remember that we do all things as unto the Lord. If it ends on social work, or if it ends on, oh, I'm going to be a great guitar player, and our church taught people how to be a great guitar player, and that's wonderful, and it never gets to the point of we play guitar, we kayak, we teach people these things that they enjoy, we share with other people, we're going to get to that. For the sake of the glory of God, if we don't quite make that final step, then really it's all human work, it's all worldly endeavors, and it's really not that valuable. It's a wood, hay, and stubble, if you get the reference from the Bible there. So we're all called to teach, and maybe you're like, oh, I'm not a Bible teacher, that's not my gift. Well, there is a gift of teaching, and maybe that's not your gift, but you're all called to teach. So what is it that you can teach? In 1 Peter chapter 4, if you want to look over there, it reminds us that based on the gift they have received, everyone should use it to serve others as good managers of the varied grace of God. So maybe your gift is teaching, and you should be doing some teaching. Maybe your gift is some sort of carpentry, and you should be doing that. But we all, if we remember back to Colossians, we teach the next person in line. Maybe it's the next generation by age. Maybe it's the next generation of followers of Jesus, but we teach the next. So whatever it is that you have, you pass it on, and we do all things as unto the Lord. So this is the basis of what we're talking about this morning, is that Larry had something that he offered me. Now, I believe he offered me, I would consider him and Sarah to be one of my several spiritual parents that saw me progress in the Lord. Now, we know that the best place for that to happen is the home, but we won't talk about my life. My parents are faithful church members today, and praise the Lord for that. And they were good church members back then, but that's a different discussion. But not to say anything bad about them. I was a bit rebellious. That being said, I had multiple spiritual parents along the way that saw me mature. So they offered me, each of them, what they had to see me progress in my own human development as well as my spiritual development. And what happens in the church, if we'll do this the right way, whether it's taking guitar lessons or learning how to frame a house or fix a car or whatever else, when the people of the Lord do things as unto the Lord, then your spiritual life and your human life are not disconnected anymore. When you're framing a house and talking about the Lord, or as I did and painted a house or painted multiple houses and talked about the Lord, or learned guitar lessons and talked about the Lord, or fixed a car and talked about the Lord, that your spiritual life and your physical, worldly, human life are no longer disconnected. And when we have those disconnected, we have problems. That's when we go to church on Sunday and we talk about how bad it is to have drums in church, and then we get in our car and listen to music with drums in it. It's like, I see that all things as unto the Lord, but aren't you the temple of the Holy Spirit? I'm throwing stones. I shouldn't do that. Let's continue on this idea that we all have a job to do, and I can't not talk about this. Matthew chapter 28 is going to remind us that we all are called to make disciples, and we're going to see this concept of teaching, not that you necessarily have the gift of teaching, but that you would teach people things as part of this. So go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So most of us know this as the Great Commission. And if you're like me, you grew up in church hearing it as a evangelistic verse. You got to go tell people about Jesus, but that's not what it says. It says make disciples. Who are the disciples? Were the people in the crowd that Jesus preached to? No. Were they the people in the crowd that Stephen or Peter preached to? No. They were the people that followed and matured in the walk of the Lord day in, day out, step by step. That's what a disciple is, not a convert. It's a committed follower of Jesus that's maturing in their walk with Jesus. So he tells the disciples, go therefore make disciples. So hey, you've saw me for the past 3 years make you into a disciple. Now you go do what I did to other people. This is the command that Jesus gives his disciples, and by extension, he gives us. It's not the preacher's job. It's not the Sunday school teacher's job. It's not even the worship leader teaching the new guitar player's job. It's all of our jobs to teach. Because notice what it says in verse 20. Teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. All these verses start intertwining together. Go back to Colossians chapter 3, and we're going to notice something here. Because we teach, let the message of the Messiah dwell in you richly. I can't read that right for some reason this morning. Let the message about the Messiah dwell richly among you, teaching and admonishing, or teaching and correcting one another in all wisdom, and singing hymns and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. Notice it says teaching and admonishing. It's not just communication of information here. It's, hey, this is how we follow the Lord, and then let's come back and you work on that, and we're going to talk about it. And then you go out and you practice following the Lord, and then we'll talk about it. It's just like a guitar lesson, right? Hey, here's this solo you're going to work on. You go work on it, and then come back, and I'm going to tell you how you've been practicing it wrong all week, and then you're going to go practice it again, and then you're going to come back, and I'm going to talk about it again. So it's teaching, hey, this is how you do it, and then it's correction when we're doing things wrong. Or as we mature in the Lord and we have less maybe formal relationships in discipleship, though we should have some formal relationships in discipleship. You should be discipling somebody and someone should be discipling you. And or, I need to slow my speech here. But it's also in the community of faith, remember we were talking about community this morning, where you go to your brother and say, hey man, I've been noticing this thing in you, and I want to say, you're doing a great job, and I want to encourage you and admonish you, and I encourage and admonish, but encourage you. Or, brother, I see this in you, and maybe this is not something that the Lord is working on you, or maybe you haven't noticed yet, but I see this in you, and it's not really good, and it's not going to lead to good things to you, and I love you enough to point this out to you, and that's admonishment, okay? So that's in the community of faith. So we might have really intimate relationships, we might have less intimate relationships, but we all can value from that community and relationship with one another. Let's continue moving. So we're all called to make disciples. I think it's very important, and I have to bring that up. So the first thing is that we would teach. So in the bros trip to Winston-Salem to take the light of the gospel in that godless city, I'm in a weird mood this morning. I'm sorry. I haven't had enough sleep this week. I apologize. But in the bros trip, where I was introduced to a guitar solo, I was taught something that Larry had to offer. And it would be easy for us to scoff at that and say, oh, that's not of the Lord, that's not a Bible study, that's not anything. Well, but it was significant in my life, and it made an impact, and I played guitar in the praise band for a long time. And was it because I learned that solo? No. But it's a point of communication and relationship building and community. If it had stopped at guitar solos about Journey, yes, it would have been unfruitful, but it didn't stop there, and that's the point this morning. We can go to Hebrews chapter 13 now. So the first idea is teaching. What does it mean to be in a community with one another? The idea this morning is that it will be very practical. What does it mean? What do I need to do to be in community with other people? Well, you teach what you know. Teach what you know. And hopefully, if you're following Jesus, it should be part of what you know is what it's like to follow Jesus. The next one here is that you would learn to share. Do not neglect to do good and to share, for God is pleased with such sacrifices. If you read the greater context here, it's clearly talking about sort of physical possessions. So you have food and I don't have food, you share with me. And if I have a car and you don't have a car, I share with you. And if I have a house and you don't have a house, I share with you. And many of us know the passages from the book of Acts where the early church is just together and they're in community, and we look at that and go, that's amazing. And they sold things that says a person had extra land and they sold the land to meet the needs of somebody else, and nobody had a need among them. It's amazing. So this passage, if you look at the greater context here, it's talking specifically about possessions. So physical possessions, money, food, housing, whatever, right? But I want to challenge us this morning and look at the initial understanding as possessions, but then look at the greater application. Don't neglect to do good and to share, for God is pleased with such sacrifices. Well, let's think about that for a second, because It might not be all that taxing for me to give you a little bit of money. It would be. But it might not be. It might not be that taxing to let you borrow the extra car that I have in the parking lot or to live in my guest room. But what might be very taxing, a big sacrifice for me, is if you ask me for my time. You want to go have lunch and talk about something? That might be very difficult for me to give up. What about if you want me to focus and concentrate? Don't laugh. That might be very difficult for me. I'm focusing on my stuff and my family and my job and what I have to do. And you're asking me, whether literally or figuratively, to shift my focus and focus on you or focus on your problem and help you figure out something or to concentrate on what's going on in your life. Now, that's just good friendship. That's just good community. But it's something I have to choose to do. I have to sacrifice my own selfishness. This is what we're talking about right here, right? I'm going to give up what I want in order to give to somebody else. Now, that doesn't matter whether that's a side of beef or if that's my time. It's a sacrifice either way. Is that right? Is this a faithful application of this passage? I think it is. What about some other things? Maybe my concern. It's easy for me to give you some time. It's easy for me to fix your problem, but I'm going to be a good spouse, and I'm going to care about your problems. Not just fix them, but you want me to care about you. This is another level of sacrifice. Not just about me anymore, but it's about other people. And you think, well, that's just obvious, Daniel. You should be doing that. That's good Christian stuff. That's my point. That's my point. Being a good Christian, being in community with other people, is some of these things that we go, oh, that's obvious. But are we doing it? Am I sacrificing my own concern for my own problems and my own day-to-day for someone else? What about my energy? You know, it's a lot easier for me at the end of the day to veg out on the couch and watch a few episodes of some family-appropriate TV show. It's much easier for me to do that. It takes a lot more energy to go, well, I'm going to go over to Larry's house because, you know, they got to collect. I don't know what you do on the farm now. I don't know. He's turned into a farmer down there in Coleridge. He used to be the guy that went and took me to guitar shows. Now he farms. So, I mean, it's cool either way, I guess. I'm just, you know, there's not a lot of Mesa boogie stacks in the barn. If you know, no one gets that reference. Never mind. Just a few people in the back. Okay, I'm going to move on. I've picked too niche of an intro this morning. My point being, we are to share with one another to the point of sacrifice. We are to give to the point of sacrifice. And I don't think it is limited to cutting a check or giving a side of beef or whatever, the physical possessions. I think time and energy and concern and care and focus and concentration and knowledge is a sacrifice, and it's a valuable thing to share with other people, just like if I were to give you $50. Maybe more so, especially nowadays. That brings me to a broader point I want to make, or I think we should make this morning, and that's for the concept of the variety of community. Variety of community. And what I mean by that is that the world would put us into siloed groups. All right? You with me? So when you go to K through 12 in the public school, you know, it's just first graders, it's just second graders, it's just third graders, right? And then when we go out in the world, it's just Democrats, it's just Republicans. If it's just rich people, it's just poor people, it's just this group, it's just that group. The world wants to divide people up into all these disparaging groups, and then we circle the wagons and we say we don't like that group. And at times, maybe there's a reason why we say that. Maybe there's a reason to point out differences between what they believe and what we believe, or what they think and what we think, and what they do and what we do. Especially when you're raising kids, okay? I'm not ignorant here. But in the church, we've bought into this concept a little too much, I think. That in community, there's a value and a beauty to variety. There's a beauty when the 13-year-old wannabe guitar player hangs out with, I don't know how old you were, I'm going to say mid-30s, well-experienced guitar player, and connects. And the mid-30s guitar player is able to say, guitar playing is great and all, but what about this? And I was exposed to like super good Christian guitar players as well, and not so good Christian popular music that met a need from some of the trash I had listened to previously. So there's a connection there, and there's a variety there. And do you think the other 13-year-old pseudo-Christian in the church was going to provide me with that same kind of community? I don't think so. Now, they would understand what I was going through. They would understand what it's like to go to school in my day, and they would be able to connect on a peer-to-peer relationship, and there's value in that. There's a place for connecting with your peers, people in your stage of life, people with your struggles, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's a greater value, if I can say that, with connecting with someone who has surpassed your current struggles. Someone that has said, you know what, I was 13 one time, and that thing you think so important is really not that big a deal. I was 16 one time, and I crashed a car too. Ask Anthony about his car story. He's the cool pastor. He's wrecked a car. I don't know. You're losing cool points with that, I think, or something. I'm not sure. Preacher making bad jokes. Here's my point. Variety of community is valuable, and it's necessary. There's a place for peer-to-peer. When we have youth get together, that sort of thing, young adults get together, people with similar stages of life get together. There's value in that. Okay, there's a place for that. There's a feeling of belonging and comfort and all that sort of thing. But the world doesn't value variety of community like they claim to. It's very uncommon in modern day. And when you and I are given the choice, we often don't choose it. We often do not seek out the person that's different than us, whether it's in age or social class or background or a race or ethnicity or whatever else. We don't seek out that other person. We seek out someone very similar to us. This is why we typically go to church and we go to whatever clubs and groups you're a part of and whatever, even your workplace. We choose based on people that are similar to us. And if you ever worked somewhere where you didn't fit in, you might have stuck around for the paycheck, but you never felt like you fit in because they were different than me. For whatever reason. But variety of community has value, great value. And there's all these cliche points we always point to when we talk about this, right? We can say, the children, they have the energy. They have the energy and the spirit, and they have the faith in the future, and it's true. It's absolutely true. But there's more to it than that. We point out that young people, like teenagers, we need them around so we can learn how to use our smartphones. That's true, but there's more to it than that. Well, we need them old people around because they have wisdom. And we need to get that. That's true, but there's more to it than that. Well, we need the middle-aged people around because they have money and disposable time. We need them around. Those young people, young kids, they're pretty much useless. We don't have any value from them. Those parents, they're so frazzled anyway. They have nothing left to offer. And Rebecca and I said, what? Did you say something? I fell asleep a little bit. So there's these cliche things that are true. We say them because they're true. There is energy, and I thank you for sharing that about children. There was a big energy shift in here when the children all left. It got quieter too, but a big energy shift. But there's more value than that. There's benefit for me sharing with them. I'm blessed because I share with them, and then they share with me things that I don't understand or know. And there was we went to a conference about foster care not too long ago, and one of the ladies pointed out that she had a really, really hard time early on in placement, and she realized that though it might not be God's ideal plan, God was using that to show all the problems she had. Because every time it rubbed her wrong and she freaked out, it's like, oh, this is really that's not really their fault. This is really my fault, and it's just showing my problems. And it was an opportunity for her to work through some of the issues she had in her past and some of the un-Jesus-like pieces of her character in that moment. So that's a blessing from a child to an adult that we don't think about. It's a variety of community, but if we don't ever get that variety of community, then we won't ever get these many, many blessings and values. Diversity is beautiful, and not just diversity in one or two issues, but in a variety of diversities. It's comfortable to be peer-to-peer, but when did God call us to be comfortable? I don't think it was in this world that he called us to be comfortable. And it's not in the real world that we live in peer-to-peer, is it? Anybody here worked in a job that it's only your age group and your generation? Any older people here? Jordan raised his hand. Thanks, Jordan, for ruining my analogy. Anybody here ever tired of working millennials at all? Older folk? But it emulates K through 12. A lot of times we emulate the K through 12 concept, and the church has decided to take on the same thing. But what happens in schools, K through 12, is not discipleship. It's not community, it's not family, and it's not church. It may be education, that's a different discussion for a different day, but it's not disciple making. It's not life transformative, not what happens in worksheets and textbooks. Some of the other stuff that goes on in public school system or in school systems, K through 12, graded school systems, it's pretty life transformative too. But I think we see in that analogy that community has power to shape people's lives, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the not so good. And that's true of any community. And I think that's the other value of variety. There's an old saying, and I think there's probably not, I think the original is probably pretty crass, but it's sort of the blind leading the blind, if you're with me. When we get a bunch of people of the same age that know the same thing, that come from the same socioeconomic class, live in the same region, the same group, and we put them all in the same class and we let them build a community together, it's sort of the blind leading the blind. Now, they're not there to build community. They're there to learn and be educated by a teacher who's hopefully qualified. But in the church, we have an opportunity, unlike a school, because we're doing different things. We're not here to educate. We're here to make disciples. We've already talked about that. We're here to build community. We're here to be a family. We're here to be the church. So we have an opportunity to have a variety in our community so that from the littlest child all the way up to the oldest saint has an opportunity to benefit and grow through that community. And we do that through teaching each other what it is I have to teach and sharing with each other what it is I have to share. So we need to be careful in the way that we orient our lives, and the children's people are going to be mad because it's going to be a quick sermon. I could look up a few more verses. If you will, turn to, what's that really long psalm? Psalms 119. We'll just read it. No. We need to be careful in how we orient our lives to not just seek out comfortable relationships. You don't have to seek out like the person that's miserable to be with, but seek out somebody that's maybe in a different life stage than you. Maybe sees things a little bit different than you. Maybe comes from a bit different background than you do. Seek those things out and orient your life in that sort of way. We have a problem in this country where we live in, I think they call it an echo chamber, where we only listen to the voices that we like. And maybe that's not as big a deal when it comes to politics or something like that, something insignificant. But when it comes to something important like your faith, you need to fill your chamber with biblical people. Yes. Don't fill it with heretics. That's a problem. Fill it with biblical voices, but not just ones that think and believe and orient yourself the way you do. Maybe ones that lived in a different generation or a different country or a different socioeconomic class or just just looked at a different way. Maybe if you're from a Pentecostal background, you listen to a few Baptists. If you're from a Baptist background, maybe listen to a few Wesleyans. There's the different voices out there, and for the most part, there's a lot of them that are foundationally biblical. We might disagree on some of the things on the top, but the foundation is we're all agreeance in the biblical. Some of us, and so get some of those voices in your life, and not just the person on the radio and the person on YouTube, but a few of the people in your life, at your dinner table, on your couches, your very, very stained couches, if you're like me. So we need to be careful how we orient our lives, and then by extension, we need to be careful how we organize our church. That we value the peer-to-peer, that there's a place for that. And there was a time in my ministry when I devalued that sort of thing and didn't see that because I didn't need it. I was hanging out with Larry, and he had kids, and that was weird. I remember one time we went to Virginia, Owen in here, and like my job, at least the way I interpreted it, it may be not been true, but I think it was Larry and Sarah taking pity on the poor little kid that came to church. But my job, my interpretation on the trip to Virginia, as we perused the southern monuments, was to entertain Owen. That's weird. By the world standards, there's no part of that statement that's not weird. But in church world, that should be fairly normal. Hey, there's a teenager that doesn't go on many vacations, and our family is going on a vacation, a very family-type vacation, and Owen doesn't have anybody to play with. Well, Daniel's basically a small child. Bring him. He's a small child in a very tall body. Just bring him along. So we need to be careful how we organize our churches as well, that we don't undermine this variety of community that we get when we teach each other. Because like 2 16-year-olds really have very little to offer each other, let's be honest. And 2 35-year-olds have very little to offer each other, let's be honest. I mean, it's something. Friendship. But a variety of community is very important. So let's move to the last verse, Galatians chapter 6. And we just covered this in our Galatians series, but I want to point it back out again. Therefore, as we have the opportunity, we must work for the good of all, especially those who belong to the household of faith. So you can stop at each of those commas, right? As we have opportunity. So there's sort of a flip side of that. Like, it's not saying everybody's going to go on a mission trip every day of their life. But it's also saying you probably should keep your eyes open for opportunities. So we're not living the extremes, we're living in reality of I have an opportunity to sacrifice and love and share and give and teach, and make disciples. And he's not asking me to be crazy to do it. Like God's like, you live in a broken world, you're going to have a job. You live in a broken world, like sometimes diapers and dinner and making it to bed is going to consume everything after you get home from work. Like that's reality. But as you have opportunity, look for opportunities. So many times we say, I just don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. My grandma said, you can't do what you don't want to do. And you don't have time. You do have time for what you want. If you want to do it, you'll find time to do it. You'll open your eyes and you'll find time to do it. And it's not easy. It's a sacrifice. We already covered that. Sharing is a sacrifice. Even it's sharing your time and sharing your energy and having to clean the house because we're having company come over. Like, this is a sacrifice. It's much easier to leave the dishes piled up in the sink than it is to clean them because y'all are going to come over and think we nasty. We ain't nasty. We have 4 kids. And some people use more dishes than they ought to. And some people are not really good at loading dishwashers. So be careful how we orient our lives and organize our churches so that we can have opportunities. If I can, just take a moment here and pump the brakes. And I like a word when we start talking about have opportunity is something I'm really bad at, if I'm honest, and that's margin in your life. Margin is sort of a business term, and that means like we have some wiggle room at the end of the month. Maybe it's wiggle room in time. Maybe it's wiggle room in money. Maybe it's wiggle room in food. Maybe it's wiggle room in focus and energy and brain space. But I think sometimes we don't see opportunities because we don't have opportunities because we don't have any space left. I mean, that's me, man. I say yes to a bunch of things I probably should say no to, and I prioritize things that maybe could wait, and I miss opportunities. So as we have opportunity, we must work for the good of all. So we can't be a Christian group that's isolated in ourselves, because it says especially the next word, not excluding or an exclusively to or anything like that. It says we must work for the good of all. Now, are we the welfare system? No. But do we work for the good of all? Yes. Do we try to bless and love and treat everybody like Jesus? Yes. Yes. Now, especially for the household of faith. And this gets sticky, right? Because it would be easy to say, I'm going to prioritize my family. Whether you mean biological family or you mean church family, I'm going to prioritize, my family comes first. And that's sort of what this is saying. But I think we have to take this verse in its entirety, and the band can come. As we have opportunity. Did you have opportunity to do good to the household of faith? Yes. Well, then do it. Did you have opportunity to do good to the heathen neighbor you have? Well, then do it. Did you have opportunity to do good to your family member that goes to a different church? Well, then do it. Did you have opportunity to do good to your brother-in-law who's a big jerk? Then do it. I don't think there's any part of that verse that we need to get too hung up on, because it's one verse. So the conclusion of our sermon series on community is just an application sermon. It's really simple. How do we as New Life, how do we as my family, how do we as me as an individual follower of Jesus obey and flourish in the community that God designed for us to live in? Well, one way is that you can teach somebody or be taught. One way is that you can share or receive. And at the end of the day, look for opportunities to do good. You know, there's like probably a dozen books on that bookshelf, and I probably have another dozen at home, and there's a few hundred you could buy online about how to have community or small groups or fellowship or whatever in church. And we have program after program and gathering after gathering and meal after meal, and we don't see what we saw in the book of Acts. And I think it's because we're trying to reproduce the results instead of reproducing the source. The source was Jesus, right? They were just doing what they saw Jesus do for 3 years. And we look to Acts and say, I want to do what they did. We start a program or we start a group. And then we don't live like Jesus. We've got to emulate the source. So it falls under the category perhaps of easier said than done. Lord, I thank you for this morning and a reminder of how you've blessed us with this thing called the church, with a community, a family. Lord, I know that there's not a person in here that hasn't taken that for granted, that hasn't diminished what it means to be a part of a church community. I know there's not a person in here that hasn't at one point or another said, we're going to go to church service. And that's fine. I know there's not a person in here who hasn't visited worship just to check it off their list. Well, I went to church. I'm part of a church. But Lord, I know that there's very few people, if anybody in here, who have really they've seen what it looks like to live as your family. Lord, I pray that you would work in me first. Pray that would be the prayer of many people here, that you would work in me first to live out what it means to be a part of a community. That I would take responsibility for how I orient my life. I would take responsibility for the relationships that I have and how I give and how I teach and how I share. that out of emulating you, this community that you've designed us, that you've created us to live in, would blossom and flourish. Thank you.